Okay, well, I'm just going to go ahead and begin. I don't know who else is going to turn up. We had a lot of people register, but it might be that people are going to listen to the recording. And I just think our time is very short, and so I just want to go ahead and start. As people join, we'll hopefully catch up with them. So, since our time is fairly short together, I'm not going to make a big introduction. What I did was I looked at everybody's answers, and then I mean, obviously, I don't know a lot of people, so I had to determine from the answer, which was often very short, what I thought somebody might want to discuss. And so I put people into very loosely into sort of groups. And then obviously people can tell me if they want to talk about something else instead. I think the thing about writing, really, or the thing about voice, is that there are as many ways to talk about it as there are writers. And yet at the same time, there is something obviously common to that aspect of writing because voice can never be anything other than ourselves. And so when people, some of the people said, I want tips on finding my voice. There aren't really tips on finding your voice because your voice is already who you are. The the difficulty is that in a lot of classes, a lot of the focus is really on the craft, which is absolutely necessary. Craft is the most important things that a writer can learn, however they do it, whether they do it in class, whether they do it through reading great authors, whether it's a combination of both. However it is, we need to really learn the skill of craft. So nothing that I'm saying today or anywhere is ever going to throw craft away. And I think that's the key. It's not, and the kind of writing voice I'm talking about is not confessional. We're not talking about doing daily pages and getting in touch with our psychology or any of those things. It's a much bigger thing than that, the writing voice. And of course you can't teach it really. So that's actually one of the reasons why so few people talk about it, because it can't really be taught. And here I am actually trying to teach it. Well, I'm really trying to facilitate it more than I'm trying to teach it. I think that's about all that I really want to say about that. Okay, so Vana, I'm just going to start with you. You wrote, let me find what you wrote, because it was good. It was actually very good, and it is something important, and I want to talk about it anyways. All right, so what Vana said was, I love the way my novel starts, but it seems to me that the story goes on. But it seems to me that as the story goes on, the plot overshadows the voice. But I need the plot, but I want the voice to be sustained. So I hope this webinar will help me find a way to keep the voice fresh and true throughout the story. So first of all, Vana, tell me, when you're talking about the voice, what voice are you talking about?
Well, two things.
Mm-hmm.
There's the voice of my character, but also there's the overall tone of the story, which I want to maintain a humorous undertone to the story. I don't want it to get too dark, but as some darker things happen, it's obvious that I need to let go of the humorous, but I want to be able to bring it back up naturally without, without making less of the dark things that are happening, but I want to be able to come back up to the light-hearted aspect of the book because I want the overall tone of the book to be one of humor and adventure and friendship. So I want to keep those things going, even though I have, things happening to the character, which of course have to be tense and frightening.
Okay, so you see, you're talking, which is okay. So then I was right in understanding what you said. See, you're talking about story voice, and I'm talking about your voice, and these two voices are different.
Okay.
Your voice should be the thing that is always guiding anything that you write. And your story voice is going to change. And somebody actually asked this question, but I don't think she's on. I won't really have a chance to speak with her. But she more or less said this. I think she's at a different place from you, Vana, because I think she's much more of a new writer, and you're quite an experienced writer. I think you're a published writer. Is that correct?
No, I'm not.
Oh, but
I've
you're
been writing
represent.
for quite a long time. I had an agent for a few years, and I'm
Oh,
currently about to start looking for a new one.
oh, okay, all right. But then it means that you have quite a bit of experience because if you had an
Yes.
agent, then you have quite a bit. So this was somebody who was, I think, is newer, and she asked that her name is Maruk. I hope I'm saying her name correctly. She said, I know about the story arc, but how do you find your voice? In fact, what exactly is voice? Is your voice different for different stories, or does it come across consistent across different stories? The answer is yes, your voice is consistent across everything that you will ever write. It may change and it may develop, it will change and it will develop based on your life experience. But your story voice or your essay or your article or your blog post or whatever it is, that's going to change according to whatever is required of that particular platform or subject matter. So, Vana, when you say to me that you want the tone of your voice or the story's voice to remain consistent, which I understand, what I would say to you is you have to look from the inside. Right now, you're trying to do it all from the outside, and that's why your plot is actually overshadowing the narrative voice. Because to a certain extent, the narrative voice is also on the outside. And I'm not trying to split you as a writer and say that you are not your narrative voice, because obviously everything in your writing is you. Narrative voice, characters, subject matter, themes, everything. But if you let your writing voice actually guide you, your heart and mind and soul, if you let that guide you and you look into your own experience for the answers rather than to your plot, I think you're going to find the narrative voice because you already know what the narrative voice is for your story. I'm going to just assume that you're correct in believing that the narrative voice is completely right for the story. But one of the difficulties with doing the plotting from the outside is that it can become very formulaic. It becomes alien in some ways to who the writer is. I mean, there are writers, of course, who identify with that very strongly, but there is a way to think about the plot from the inside instead of just only from the outside. And then what you will find is that all those plot points that you've learned in various classes through books, reading other writers, will naturally fall into place. And you're not trying to fit yourself into somebody else's container. Does this make sense to you, Vana?
Actually, it does. You've immediately turned on a light bulb of something I learned years ago and had simply forgotten as I get further and further into the story. Like I said, when I first start it, I'm always right there and it's me and I'm there with the senses and memory and everything that I've put into the story.
Mm.
But as I go on, I tend to forget to do that. And so something I remember it was being called, and I don't recall why it was called this, but it was the teacup method of, for every scenario, make sure that you're pulling from a personal experience to get the feelings and emotions and senses of that moment in the story. And I
Right.
think that that's what I have let go of as I've continued on in the story.
I mean, I think what you're describing is something that's very common. It seems to happen. I mean, it certainly happened almost across the board with the writers I had just finished working with at Savvy Authors. And they were all very strong writers, and they all had a large amount of experience in craft. Every single one of them was struggling in some way with the conflict and the contradiction of what they'd been taught in craft classes and what their own natural inclination as a writer was. And because in the end, we have to go with our own inclination as a writer, regardless of what the market says and the market wants. Because the truth of the matter is, the market doesn't know what it wants. Salespeople know what they want. But the market actually doesn't know what it wants, because if it did, all the 13 major publishing houses who turned down J.K. Rowling would have all been bidding that book up to $1 million instead of her getting an advance of about $4,000 and a 500 print copy on the first run. So clearly, the market only knows what has been successful before now. But our job as writers is to actually give readers something that they don't already know. The goal of the story is to transport the reader to a world they have never imagined. Whether that's a contemporary world, whether it's things that you think are everyday stories, whether it's romance, whether it's erotica, whether it's fantasy, it doesn't really matter. That is the goal of the story. Otherwise, why should the reader spend time, which is actually more precious than money, reading your story if it's something they've already read somewhere else? So I feel that's important for every writer to take on board and really think about. And it means letting go of market expectations and in fact writing the book in such a way that you may never get a reader, but you'll be writing it from your own truth, which is far more important than somebody else's truth, because somebody else is already doing that truth. And writing is incredibly difficult. So if we're going to spend a lot of time doing it, we really need to respect the fact that we have a talent for writing. It's an incredibly difficult talent in the spectrum of art talents, primarily because we have nothing outside of words in order to share what it is that we want to share with the reader in this particular case. If you're a musician, you have an instrument, even if it's your voice. If you're a painter, you have supports, paper, canvas, you have paints, you have pencils, you have external objects. If you're in theater, you have external objects. A writer only has words, and words, in some ways, there are two things going on with words. One is they're very familiar to us because we use them all the time. The other is that they are, to some degree, abstract in the sense that we've learned them so well that we don't think about them. And yet, if we do stop and think about them, we realize that every word carries an idea in it. If I say tree, everybody thinks of a tree. They usually don't think of a table. And so the writer, so the second part to that is that then writing is about making language one's own. And and that means that you spend time really thinking about language and not just putting down mundane language. You really think about, how does this language that I'm using now, through my characters, through my narrative voice, how does it convey to my reader the content of my heart and mind and soul? And then in that way, the reader gets both things. The writer's voice, in a way, is a bridge between the story that's going to take the reader somewhere and the uniqueness of your language and how those two things come together. And that is really why, when you come across a great author, you can read any of their books and you know it's that author. You know, for example, that Tolstoy and Jane Austen are two completely different writers. And you can tell Tolstoy from Jane Austen, not just because he has Russian characters with very long, complicated Russian names, but because they are talking about different things, they're interested in different things, and their voices are completely different. So I don't know. Do you have anything else that you want to say, Vana? I feel like I've said a lot, but
Yeah, no, not at this point. I think you can move on with somebody else for right now.
okay. All right. Amy, talk to me.
I'm here.
Hello.
I wrote that I was just at that point where I had been thinking about stories so much and then had been told a couple of different ways to approach it. We had talked about this before. And then I just need to sit down and think more about I guess, let my own voice lead versus really thinking about overthinking the craft, maybe.
In what way?
Um, like going from scene to scene and thinking about spending a lot of time cataloging motives and actions and um, interactions and where they're going to go next, instead of maybe doing more free writing about it and then coming back and reining it in.
So, a lot of working on the principle of show, don't tell.
Yeah.
That really seems to be the thing that's strangling everybody. I mean, I think it's misunderstood in some ways, and I think there are people now trying to clarify that. I think also one of the problems is that we very often start writing before we're actually ready to write. That the story isn't actually clear to us. Now, if you're a writer who sits down and finds the story as you're writing it, that's one way of doing it. This doesn't negate that at all. But that finding of the story as you're writing it is not going to be the final draft of the book that you hand in to your editor or your publisher or whoever. That's finding the story. You can also find the story by brainstorming with yourself. You can find the story by thinking about it. But there's a slightly deceptive thing that goes on in craft books. And I say deceptive, but I think it's unintentionally deceptive. They tell you you can write a story in 30 days. Well, that's a plotting thing. But it's still craft. Or they tell you about the structure of the plot, or they give you all of this information about craft, or they say you have to show your scenes and not tell it. But what hardly any of them says is before you can use any of this stuff, you actually have to know what your story is. You have to know what your story is. You have to know who your characters are. And you have to have some kind of story arc in your head. You don't have to have every single detail worked out because that would be tedious too. Although I believe that Cassandra Clare actually does map everything out. But you do have to know what the story is. So, Amy, do you know what your whole story is?
You know, I have the yes. The only problem is I got thrown off with the ending, and I think that that's what's hanging me up, because when I was speaking with Mary about my ending, there was a few I wouldn't say differences of opinion, but she brought up a couple of things that I hadn't thought about, and kind of wanted me to make it a little more simpler. And so it leaves a couple of loose ends that when I sit down to start to write the thing, because it's plotted out to a certain point, maybe 3/4 of the way through, it I don't know where to go, because at certain moments that if I go the way that I had originally went, then I end up at the end that has that conflict. And I guess I'm overthinking that. Does that make sense?
The conflict being what?
Well, it's what happens with the protagonists at the end of the story, and how the whole story resolves itself, and their motivation for leaving together. They have different agendas, and they leave together, and I think that the mystery of why these two end up together was too complicated for Mary when I was talking to her about it. All the reveals at the end. And so it makes the sort of motivation of the antagonist a little, it changes a little bit, maybe,
Is
in the
it too
middle.
complicated for you?
No, I don't think so. I think that there are a few things that I need to think about a little bit more, but I think that it made sense in my mind.
Okay. As you know, Mary Buckham is one of my most favorite teachers. I think she's an incredible instructor. And I think if anybody really needs to try and understand plot and how to do it, I would vote hands down and my Bengal cat's paws down, go to Mary before you go to anybody else. That said, because you also have to remember that you were in a plotting class with her. So her goal when she was working with you is a little bit different from what I'm about to say to you. I don't think that the two things are contradictory. And I think in the end, knowing Mary as I do, I think she would concur with what I'm about to say. It is this: if you have an ending that you really believe in, you need to figure out from that ending how you get there, which means that you have to go back to the beginning of your story and work all the way through so that that ending, whether it creates a conflict or an ambiguity, becomes irrelevant because it actually makes sense to the story itself. It may disappoint the reader in the sense that the reader really hoped that these characters would do A instead of B. But if you have been true to yourself and to the characters and to the narrative voice and to everything, when you get to that point, or when the reader gets to that point, they will say, well, I wish it could have been different, but I understand why it's this way.
Yeah, no, I get that. And I get, it's interesting because I get what Mary is saying on that, because I think that that's where I'm split, because I very much so understood the logic of Mary's, what we worked out in the end, and we had discussed how that ending was happening. But there's that little part of me that says, but,
Well, then you
and
have
maybe,
to follow, no, but you have to follow the but. That's the
yeah,
thing. That's exactly what everything that I'm working with writers is about. It's about following that but, because that but could be the breakout novel.
okay.
It's it's tricky because I definitely do not want to contradict anything that experts whom I really love and admire have told you. But of course, I don't know your whole story, and I wasn't working in the class with you. I was even studying in the class with you, so I don't know the whole of what Mary told you. I just know that if you have this niggle that really you want your story to go a different way, that is what you have to follow. Because the people who come to Mary want to be able to publish their books and they want to be able to deliver something to the market that the market deems publishable. So you have to become comfortable with, is that what you want, or do you want to follow your butt or your niggle? And if you want to follow your niggle, because right now not following it up is hanging you up,
Hmm.
then you also have to say to yourself, you know what? There may not be a market for this. I may not be able to publish it, but it is really what I want to write.
Right. And I think that finishing it is more important than, for myself, you know what I mean? Making it through to the end of this story and completing the story that I set out to write is fairly
Right.
important to me.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, then I think you have to follow your own intuition at that point, because Mary can say all kinds of things to any writer, and I absolutely trust everything that she's going to say to any writer. I've done many classes with Mary, and I know that Mary will also say to you, follow your own intuition, because nothing is set in stone. Not what I'm saying, not what Mary's saying, not what Don Maas is saying, not what anybody is saying. Every writer has to follow their own truth. Otherwise, what's the point of writing? Unless unless you're a copywriter and an ad agency, and then of course you're getting paid a salary to do something. Since you want to finish the story, I just feel like, because what you're talking about is a fundamental problem for a lot of writers. And I just think right now, the best thing that you can do is take the ending that you really want and figure out the story that leads to that ending.
So just go backwards from where.
Well, I mean, you have most of your story, but what you said was you had, when you got to that point at the end, the ending that you wanted leaves loose ends in some ways. There
I
has
think
to
she
be.
thought it was too complicated. There was too much going on, which the threads of all the different characters were starting to come together in the end, and I think that she felt that that was maybe perhaps too complicated.
Well, of course, without seeing the work, I don't know, but I can tell you one of the most complex books that I've read in a very long time was Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. And she has, I don't know how many threads going throughout the novel, and it's an 860-page novel, so it's very long. And in between, there are all these footnotes and all sorts of things. One of the most miraculous things about her book, apart from the extraordinary writing and the stories that she actually tells, is the fact that she is able to tie up every single loose end at the end. And there are several characters with huge story arcs, and she ties them all up. But the way that she does it, though, is she does it individually. So you may want to think about that, Amy. Past your different characters who are all coming together at this ending, and just follow each one through to their end until you can write the end for that character, and then go back and do the next. Figure them all out and see what you have, and then see where they mesh and where they don't mesh, and see if that helps you. And if it doesn't, you and I can talk privately.
Okay, that sounds great.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Lorraine, tell me how I can help you.
My issue with plot goes to be with a lot of telling, not and show and telling, and not actually getting deep enough in point of view to fit where I should.
Okay. What was your question to me? Did you come in as a different name?
Shoemate, maybe?
Yes. So you said you want stronger voice.
Yes.
So tell me what you mean by stronger voice.
Well, I think going deeper into the POV, and I don't think I do it well enough consistently. Like I might have a scene where I do, and then the next scene I don't. I don't do it consistently enough.
Okay. So I'm going to say to you what I said to Vana, which is you're really talking about the narrative voice and the character's voice, and I'm talking about your voice.
Okay.
So I don't know if you heard what I was speaking with Vana about.
Yes.
So that applies to you too.
Yes, it does.
Everything that I said to Vana applies to you. You see that again, this whole thing of go deeper into the character's point of view, but you're doing it from the outside. You're not doing it from the inside. If you do it from the inside, then what's going to happen is you are automatically going to get to the character's deepest point of view. So the inside means you yourself have to know really who the character is and not just what their motivations are or what they have for breakfast or even some of the more deeper things that people are taught. There was an exercise I gave my writers at Savvy, and this may help you, may help everybody. If you have a pencil and paper, you may want to write it down. It went something like this. Think about your very best values, your highest values, and give one of them to each of your main characters. Whatever those values are, whether it's generosity, being absolutely truthful, being trustworthy, whatever you believe your own highest values are that are deeply important to you, take one each and give them to your protagonist and your antagonist and your villain if you have a villain. And you can, I don't know if I would say use the same value because I think that could be confusing and muddy things, but pick your best values and divide them among your main characters. And then look at your worst values, the things that you find difficult to live with about yourself, and give those to your main characters. And then look at your main characters and see what their worst value qualities are. And realize that you cannot take away the burden of them having to carry that worst value and figure out why not. And I think in that way you will figure out why your character can't let go of that burden and what they need to do to let go of that burden. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does. That's a lot of what Mary covered in her class was going, with the value system and the belief system of each character and
No, I'm not talking
getting
about
deep in that.
I'm talking about you, your value system,
Mm.
and then you giving it to the characters in the way that I just described. I'm sorry, I sort of cut you off, but there is a difference because if you only go with, well, what value system does this character have, you are still outside of yourself
Okay.
because the character is somebody you're making up, but you are not making yourself up, if you understand what I mean. You have an entire spectrum of values as Lorraine. You have an entire spectrum of values. You have moral values, you have social values, you have loyalties, you have disloyalties. You have to look inside yourself and decide what are your absolutely best values, the things that you hold most dear, and what are your worst values, the values that you know are difficult for you to live with, and give those to your characters and see what happens.
Hmm. That's a good idea. I will try that exercise and see if I can make that work because
You will
it's
be
a
able
different
to well
it's a
if you
different mindset than
it
I'm
will,
used to. You're used to learning about the characters. You're not thinking about putting your own voice into it. So that is going to take a little bit of thought here.
it's probably not going to take as much thought as you think.
Hmm.
You don't really have to think about yourself in terms of your voice. I mean, I think that's one of the things that you have to trust yourself. That is actually how it happens. It's really not about thinking, it's about trusting. So
Thank you.
yes, I mean, I think that is one of the reasons why so much remains superficial these days in a lot of the writing, because it isn't calling on the writer to bring out something that is deeply important to them. Even if you're writing something entertaining, there still has to be an element that it's actually important to you, and that's really what your voice will give to your story. Okay, I, okay, so Francine, somehow we don't seem to be able to speak. you wanted any kind of help with your novel, but the truth is, unless I can actually speak to you, I don't really know quite how to help you. Because obviously I would need more information. I just the only thing I can say is that if you need any kind of help with your novel, it means that you have a certain amount of experience already, I'm guessing. If you are brand new to writing and you're trying to write a novel for the first time, I would suggest that you go onto YouTube and you find Ray Bradbury. It's about an hour long, and he talks about new writers not really embarking on a novel straight away because you can kind of write a lot and then it will end up probably being wrong at the end of the year and you won't have anything. So what he suggests is that you write a short story every week. And the way that he says that you get ideas is you read a short story, a poem, and an essay every night before you go to bed. You do that for 1,000 days, so about 3 years you do that. And but he says, and then every week you're writing a short story. And he defied anybody to go 52 weeks and not write a great short story. So that would be one way to think about writing for anybody who's new on here. If you're not new, and I somehow feel you're not, Francine, as I said, it's going to be hard for me to help you with such little information unless, um, well, you have an idea that you want to put into a novel. I still need more information than that. So while you can type some things to me, and I'm going to talk to Laurie T for a bit. Laurie, do I still have you? Okay. Marie, do you want to talk to me?
Love to. Hello.
Hi.
Good to hear your voice. Well, when I'm writing fiction, I have not a lot of problem understanding what my voice is, getting rid of things that aren't that. When I'm writing nonfiction, that is sort of creative nonfiction, my memoirish things, I feel sometimes I can be maybe a little pedantic or didactic or something that ends with "ic" and just isn't good, too wordy. I'm looking at an example of, I wrote a piece about my father's murder, and I wrote it in a kind of light tone. I was trying to be a little funny talking about it because the point was about how I don't really know how to use this kind of weird cachet that I have, that my father was murdered by loan sharks and all this, which could be, oh, nice for street cred or something. And I really like the idea of this story, and I got a lot of good feedback on it from my writing group, but it's not quite right. I can never feel that I'm not overshooting or undershooting on some point. I don't know. I mean, it's a obviously an intense subject, but whether it's something that intense or something less intense that I'm writing about in more memoirish kind of thing, I don't know whether I'm being too strong, being too weak, being too light, or being too heavy. That's where I lose my sense of my own voice. And it's the last place you should, of course. I mean, this is my life. I know it. Why am I losing my voice there? So,
I mean, that's a really interesting question. And of course, I'm working on a memoir too, and I have my own situation, given who my parents were, and then various other things that have happened, which are both unusual but also not unique. Here is the thing that I discovered for myself. I discovered two things for myself. I mean, as you know, one of the stories that I was trying, and my memoir is really not about my parents. So that's the first thing. It's really about somebody else who was very important to me, and in fact, because of the situation, completely changed the entire course of my life. For a long time, because I couldn't deal with what had actually happened. I kept trying to write it into fiction. And of course, I could never get very far. I could kind of get so far, but not far enough. And at some point, about 2 years ago, I suddenly realized this is completely wrong. What I really should be writing is a memorial for this person, but not, not a memorial in a traditional way, but really kind of a memoir. And um, and at that moment, everything sort of changed for me. And and then, of course, I wrote 400 pages, none of which I'm ever going to look at again. And then I had a beginning that I started to rework the draft again, maybe about 6 months ago. And then got busy, and then I was teaching. And so then I started to think about it again once I stopped, once my class was over, because my students actually really inspired me. I kind of knew I needed a different beginning from how I had begun it. And the day of the big snowstorm here in Manhattan in March, I was washing up some dishes in my kitchen, and all of a sudden I knew I was actually thinking about my students, and I was thinking about a different writing project that I'm working on. And all of a sudden, I knew what the first line was for my memoir. And and even though I knew it was a line that I wouldn't forget at all, I stopped what I was doing. I went to my computer, I wrote it down. I wrote down the next couple of sentences, and then I wrote a whole bunch of text, which I knew by the time I was writing it was not what I needed, but I just stuck it in a file anyway because, most writers, we sort of don't really want to completely trash things just in case. And then it took about a week before I kind of knew how to continue. Because one of the things that I talked about with my students at Savvy was this idea of continuity. A lot of what's happening, and I'll kind of get back to your memoir in a minute, but this has sort of reminded me. Continuity means this, like the blood running in your veins and your arteries under your skin. You don't even think about it. But without it, you couldn't get oxygen to your vital organs and you would die. The same thing is true for your story or for your writing. There has to be continuity. But the way that we see it is one sentence to the next. The reader has to be able to move very smoothly without thinking, oh, now I'm reading another sentence. That continuity has to be right under the sentence, and that is your voice in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And you have to figure out how to do that. One of the reasons that newer writers are having now is because this is what I understood from writers who worked with me at Savvy, is that there's a big push to try and make writing, especially a novel, be like a film, be like a movie. A novel is never going to be a film, and it shouldn't be a film. It's not designed for that. It's not that's not the reason that somebody sits down and reads a book. No. They read a book to be transported to a world through both the external aspects of the world and the interior journey of the characters in order to have their own experience of something that is both familiar and unfamiliar. That is really the responsibility of the novel, to give the reader. If you don't give the reader that, then you've wasted the reader's time, and it's usually a lot of time. You can watch a film in an hour and a half. It's very rare that you can read a book in an hour and a half. So whatever we're doing in our books, we have to give the reader everything and more that they expected when they opened up that page and read that first sentence. And that comes really from the whole continuity thing. And what I saw in my writers, particularly one of them, who's a very strong writer and has a beautiful lyrical voice, was that things jumped. And I said, well, what's missing is the character's interior journey in these pages. And it turned out that in a class, she was told to cut all of that out.
Yeah.
So it made for very, I mean, yes, you could follow the story, but you were sort of guessing a great deal and having to kind of interpret what was going on. People are being told you have to get there quicker. This was one of the things one of my writers,
Mhm.
she was constantly told you have to get there quicker. You don't have to get there quicker. That's not your job at all as a writer. Your job as a writer is to write an opening sentence that opens the door for you and the reader to walk through. I'm quoting Stephen King at the moment. For you and the reader to walk through that door, and for you to be able to sit your reader down and say to your reader, I'm going to tell you something that you're really going to want to hear about. That's your job. That's my job. That's all of our jobs as writers to do that. And we need to carry that all the way through to the end of the story. But we can't do it if we're being told you have to write your book like a film. J.K. Rowling has a very good interview on YouTube with Steve Kloves about the films and about her interaction with him. There's a moment in that conversation, it's worth going and listening to, even if you don't particularly like her, but it's just good because you get a film screenwriter's perspective of some very successful books. There is a moment where she says, the thing about film is that the film was able to do something that took her 3 pages to lay out and show it in 30 seconds. And that's because film only deals with the externals. It only deals with the externals of the character, too. A film can only show you the external of the character. You cannot have an interior monologue of the character in a film, at least not for a sustained amount of time. You can have a narrator who can be a first voice or an omniscient narrator, but that isn't the goal of a film. A goal of a film is to show you everything through the images and through the characters interacting in the scene. But in a novel, you don't have that visual. So you have to use words to create that visual. You're creating the landscape, you're creating a visual for the characters, but you are also giving the reader the internal journey of those characters. And that was one of the things that Rowling also spoke about, that she had the luxury of giving us Harry's internal journey, or Ron's internal journey, or Hermione's internal journey. That's one of the things that I think is just really important for everybody. And in a certain way, to come back to your memoir, what you want to do is really think about your internal journey. In some ways, you have to both find the right kind of distance to write the very difficult things, such as your father's murder. Murder is a horrific thing.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it sounds worse than it was for me, though. Just so you know.
It was terrible for your father.
Yes, it was terrible for my father. It was
I
so
mean,
awful for him.
like,
Yes.
you know, so you can certainly make it humorous and you can make it all sorts of things, but you have to do it in a way that isn't manipulative, although in the end, all writing is manipulative. I mean, almost everything that I say, there's a contradiction to it. That's the other thing. There's no real absolute, in terms of approaching writing. But when it comes to your personal stories, you do have to find distance in some way. You have to be able to write about it objectively in order to write about it completely personally.
Yes.
Otherwise, it will just be confessional, or it will be not really true to the whole of you. It will only be true to some emotional aspect that has overpowered the whole experience. Does this make sense to you, Marie?
Yes. And from everything you were saying before this, about, the novel and all that, I think I see right now that I've been kind of not hitting the right balance in these stories about showing my internal journey, which is absolutely critical here, right, in the memoir, as and world building, because what I am is reconstructing, you know, time that, you know, is so different from now. You know, a lifestyle that is unimaginable for, say, a child of today. How did you live before you had, you know, phones that you carried around with you everywhere? They could. How did you live before computers? You know, and so I see that I'm not quite striking the right balance there. I'm not actually giving enough of either, and so this has been really valuable to me, and I have a lot to think about now, and a lot to work on. So I think I'm good, and I can ruminate on this and listen to everything else, and still and pick up more pieces. So thank you.
Okay. Nancy, do you want to say anything?
No, you've given me great information. I was having a problem with, I guess it's more character voice, though, as I've identified from listening.
Mm-hmm.
Had a novel completely, the whole draft done. I was working on edits, and then an editor read a few pages and said, your character's voice doesn't fit. You need to rewrite her like this. And it just stopped the whole story for me because I suddenly didn't hear my character's voice anymore.
It stopped the story for you, whatever the editor said. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I agree with her. I was writing a character who's supposed to be very poor and uneducated, and I was writing her like my voice, which is more educated. But at that point, I suddenly couldn't hear the character anymore at all, and it just stopped the story. I ended up having to move on to something else.
Okay, so tell me, why were you writing about a poor character? Just
well,
what's your interest in that?
It was the character and the situation. I just suddenly knew this story right from the beginning, what it was going to be. A girl who's trying to move out of.
Okay,
I'm sorry, what?
The only thing you have to do then is follow that. If you knew from the beginning what the story was going to be and that you had such a strong sense of it, just follow that and your character will come to life. And leave aside all the years of craft that you have learned. Just think about it. You drive, right?
Yes.
Right. Okay. How many times do you think about shifting your gears or putting on the brakes or whatever while you're driving?
I don't. It's instinct, yes.
Right. Exactly. So don't think about craft anymore. And that goes for all the experienced writers here and anybody else who's experienced and is going to listen to the webinar later on. Stop thinking about craft. You already have it. Let it go. Follow your story. Because it was clear to me, as soon as you said what you said, everything in you lit up. So that means that that was true for you. Whatever your story is, whatever came to you, that's the truth. And that's where you're going to get the most depth. And just follow that. Don't worry about what the editor said. Don't worry about the fact that maybe you haven't got the character right now. If you just follow that and don't second guess yourself, I guarantee you will write the story that you really want to write. And if you don't, I'll give you back your money on this webinar.
Okay. Thank you.
Ruth. Hello, Ruth.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Sorry,
I just wanted to
I
thank
took
you.
a long time to come back to you.
No problem. No problem. I haven't written for years now, and in this hour, I learned to take my writing and my voice seriously. That it's really my voice and it's important, and I have to listen to it and
Yes.
to let it be heard. So
Yes.
thank you very much.
Absolutely.
This is it.
You're very
Thank
welcome. You're very welcome. And if you have any questions afterwards, you can just email me.
Yes, thanks so much.
All right. You're very
Bye-bye.
welcome.
Thank you.
Bye. Is there anybody else who needs to say anything? Francine, I'm going to just try and see what you said. I know you said something about your story. Francine, can we just talk by email? Because I think I want to let everybody go because I've run way over time. Everybody's been very patient. Thank you all very much. Francine, if we can talk by email, I have your email information, and I'll just email you, and then we can kind of talk that way a little bit. Okay, great. You're very welcome. All right, so thank you so much, everybody. Anna, if you're still around, let's you and I just talk a little bit. I'll log in slightly differently, and then we can talk a little bit if you have time.
Okay.
Do you have time?
Yes, I have some time, but don't worry, Shelley. I
All
really
right.
learned a lot.
You what?
I learned a lot by listening.
Oh, good.
You
Okay.
always make me think.
I was what?
You always make me think.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Shelley. I'm excited to dive into my revisions now.
Oh, perfect. All right. Okay.
Thanks to everybody else for sharing. It was good to hear what you said.
You're welcome. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.